Hello everyone, and welcome to the ACASA webinar, Opportunities and Challenges Ahead for Ontario's Post-Secondary System, presented by Linda Franklin. A few housekeeping items to mention before we get started with today's webinar. All attendees are on mute. If you have a question for me or today's webinar speaker, please send it through the questions section on your GoToWebinar dashboard, or you can use the Raise Your Hand feature to ask a question verbally. You can access the question chat box by clicking on the plus sign next to the question header on the dashboard. To access the Raise Your Hand feature, click on the hand icon that is also located on the left side of the GoToWebinar dashboard. We will then unmute your line and you will be able to ask your question. All questions regarding the presentation content will be held until the end of the presentation, when we will open for Q&A. I would now like to introduce our presenter, Linda Franklin. Linda joined Colleges Ontario as President and CEO in 2007. She has spearheaded a system-wide marketing campaign on the value of college education, brought public attention to the impending skills shortage, and led advocacy efforts to improve pathways for students. Linda's early career included time as a partner in a consulting company, the head of communications for a regulatory body, and for government MPPs and chief of staff to an Ontario cabinet minister. Without further delay, let's begin. Linda?
Thanks very much, AJ. Yeah, thanks, folks. I really appreciate you spending the next hour with me. I am, of course, in my kitchen without the support of my handy tech folks from Colleges Ontario, but AJ stepped in and graciously helped me sort my way through. So hopefully this goes completely smoothly. I have been doing this presentation over the fall and winter for boards of colleges. But as you can imagine, this title now is a little bit deceiving because a few months ago, these slides looked a lot different than what they're going to look like today. Obviously, our reality has changed quite a bit. And I'm just trying to advance the slides, which is not working for some reason, AJ. There we go. So the world has changed a lot since our last update a year ago, and certainly even since I spoke to presidents in the fall and winter. And that, of course, has affected everything in our system, in the province, in the world at large. And it creates a lot of challenges, but I think also opportunities for colleges going forward. So before COVID-19, the government obviously had a series of priorities, and it was a relatively new conservative government whose priorities were things like balancing the budget and reducing red tape. They had a whole list of business-focused, economy-driving priorities that were meant to create a better climate for business in the province and build a legacy for the government around those issues. This was one of their signature signs and images, and many of you, particularly in border towns, will have seen these signs before. Welcome to Ontario, we're open for business. That was their mantra. Well, as you can imagine, things don't look quite the same anymore. I can't even imagine what it feels like for a government sitting on a relatively healthy economy with a clear line of sight to their priorities and what they wanted to do, to be faced with an unprecedented challenge worldwide that has basically closed everything down. And as you'll know, the Premier has just extended the lockout or the lockdown of the province into the beginning of June. So I think today on his press conference, we're going to hear some discussion about how the phasing might happen and the early businesses that'll be allowed a little more latitude to open. But it's an enormous challenge, and as those of you following the news will know, some of the places in the world who have been a bit ahead of us in this fight and who have started opening partially have in many cases found their COVID-19 cases on the rise again and have had to take a step back. our premier has been very cautious about this. And so as a result, Quebec is going forward a bit ahead of us. That will be a very interesting province to watch for us all, because I was on a call with our regional counterparts just yesterday, and the representatives from Quebec were telling us that Montreal is behind only Boston and New York City for cases per capita of COVID-19. So there's a lot of nervousness there, but also a lot of learning, obviously, that's going to happen coming out of it in that province. So given the situation that we find ourselves in today, obviously the government's priorities have changed. I heard somebody use this phrase a few days ago, and I think it sums it up nicely. What governments worldwide now are trying to do is shovel money into the economy and into people's pockets to try to build a bridge across the pandemic and get as many people over it as they can. Not everybody will be successful, but I think there's real hope that with the amount, an unprecedented amount of government spending right across the world, we may be able to bring our economy back when we are able to, with a fair degree of success. But there's always a balance, and so you can see it, they had a poll recently in the United States, and in spite of the messaging from the president about restarting their economy, almost 70% of people are still more worried about health and still believe that we shouldn't move too quickly. So this balancing act for all of us and the province and every government is really challenging. And yet at the same time, the governments have to be able to provide some hope to citizens, some sense that things will return, if not to normal, at least to a new normal, that there is hope that the economy will restart, that our parents, our sons and daughters, our families will all be safe and well, but also able to earn a living again. So that's what the government has been thinking about for these weeks. And I think the particularly striking thing is for a government that was entirely focused on deficit reform, the idea of eliminating annual budget deficits isn't on the table for anybody. I don't think any government on the planet has an eye to that issue anymore, not even our most conservative ones. Again, before COVID-19, when we talked to the government about their priorities in this coming year, they were pretty clear. Many of you have been involved in the outcome-based work, developing strategic mandate agreements. This was the year the government was going to pull the trigger on the first funding attached to these outcomes, 10%, moving up to 60% in the system. They were very concerned about the lack of apprentices and tradespeople in the economy and pending retirement, so they were keenly focused on apprenticeship reform. They were looking at developing an international strategy for international students, recognizing that this has become a big enterprise, particularly Ontario, but certainly through Canada, and wanting to get some sense of the policy framing for that. They had just started a digital strategy, looking at all of our resources from eCampus to Contact North to the work that LinkedIn has been doing and what the government should be doing in this space to draw those things together. And they were taking a run at intellectual property issues, mostly in the university sector. The other thing that they were really interested in were micro-credentials. And from their perspective at that time, that was really about a sense that the economy was moving very, very fast, and there was a need to get skilled workers into jobs with the right skills that employers were looking for much more quickly than we have been. Oh, it's all right. So, has the government agenda changed? Well, it sure has. Although, interestingly, it's still focused around many of the same things. The government still wants to move ahead with strategic mandate agreements. And interestingly, the first meeting we had with presidents and the deputy right after the pandemic first started and people realized part of the magnitude of it, we had the civil service tell us that many institutions were still very keen on strategic mandate agreements and outcome-based funding, and they were going to proceed because of that. Well, within a week, the minister had stepped in and decided that until COVID-19 is in our rearview mirror, until we have a sense of the landscape, we are not going to be looking at changing how we fund institutions. And Primarily, I think, aside from the fact that we have a crisis in the province and the world, it's also because in the midst of that crisis, it's going to be impossible to figure out what the baseline measurements of anything are on which to build outcome-based funding. So that's no longer something that's in our immediate priority list or the government's. The international strategy is still front and center, but now really it's about how do we maintain our international student base in the province. I think for the first time, perhaps, the government has a very clear line of sight into what international students mean in our economy, in our institutions, and a sense of the peril that losing a group of international students creates for the province. So they're keenly focused on that. The Council of Ministers of Education, all of them right across the provinces, have sent a letter now to the federal minister asking that the minister look at international students seriously for the fall, think about letting them take, as they are in the summer, their first tranche of college courses online in their home community, and they're looking at that seriously federally. The online debate has changed completely, you know, from we probably need to move this along a little more quickly, but certainly in K-12, we're getting a fair amount of resistance from teachers. We're not sure how quickly we can move this ahead in post-secondary, to a hugely accelerated priority. And I think we would all probably have not imagined how quickly we could move to an online universe when faced with this crisis. So that capacity to move quickly, to do these courses online, has certainly got governments right across Canada interested in what the future might look like there. And then finally, micro-credentials. Certainly, the government is even perhaps more focused on this issue, but it's really now changed from getting workers upskilled for the businesses they're already working in and getting more workers into a fast-moving economy to figuring out how, when many workers, no doubt, will find themselves in industries that are very challenged, companies that no longer exist, industry norms that have changed coming out of the crisis. How do we use micro-credentials to help reskill those workers and help people who may have lost their place in the workforce find it again? Now, interestingly, the leaders, particularly Justin Trudeau federally, who only won a minority government in the last election a year or so ago, our Premier, Doug Ford, who was doing very badly in the polls just before this. A crisis has a way of changing that landscape, and it certainly has here. So when you look at these numbers, you can see that the huge jump up in approval ratings for our Prime Minister and our Premier, and this is consistent right across the country, mean that they will probably have a much longer runway than we might have initially expected to manage this crisis through its iterations, whether it takes until a year from now or 2 years from now to complete. Our expectation is we will, unless things change, we will probably see the same governments elected in most of the country for a next round. That being said, of course, there are some big challenges ahead for them all, and most of them come in the form of the kind of deficits that they are all facing. So again, as we talked about, no country, no provincial economy, no state economy is thinking about balancing the budget. But these numbers that you see in front of you on the screen, 41 billion one-year deficit in Ontario, 250 billion federally, are unprecedented historic levels of debt. Almost. We had some of this kind of debt level around the world wars. And so it's interesting that we faced this kind of challenge before. The debt levels were not as high coming out of 2007, 2009, but they were enormous then too. And interestingly, in spite of all the fears that people had, it turned out that when the economy restarted and grew fairly quickly, it was not as big a challenge as people thought to start to bring those deficits under control. The biggest challenge, perhaps, is how much of the labor force has lost their jobs in the last little while since this started. 45% of the labor force now receiving some kind of federal government support. So that is the challenge facing all of our governments once we come out of this crisis. And interestingly, they're also faced with challenges about the psychology of this for people, partly because even though the economy was really doing pretty well before the pandemic, that wasn't necessarily how the Canadian public perceived it. So the next few slides are slides that are based on polling that we did in the late fall. And as you can see here, this is before the pandemic started. People broke about a third into achievers, people that were positive about the economy and their opportunities, people who were struggling in their view, and people who felt completely alienated from society, the economy, and so forth. And when we asked them their views about the economy and the Canadian dream then, even there, as you can see, most people still felt that in Ontario they could be anything they wanted to be if they were willing to work for it. But virtually the same number of people felt that for them personally, no matter how hard they worked, they just couldn't seem to get ahead. So this is before the pandemic in a relatively healthy economy. And when you asked parents how they felt about their sons and daughters' chances, similarly, almost 70% of them at that time thought that it was going to be far more difficult entering the job market. Partly, we think, that feeling was driven by the fact that a lot of people, even in this time, didn't really understand. We were, as you recall, it seems like such a long time ago, but just a few months ago, our main conversation was about AI and the, new economy and what it was going to look like. And people were telling us then, 60% of people, they didn't really understand what that all meant. Interestingly, though, the folks who did the best at saying, I do have a clear understanding of the new economy, were people with a college connection. Not sure why, but I have to think that part of it might be because they were more closely connected to college programming and visions that showed you a much clearer path from courses and programs to current jobs. Because people were so concerned, we think, about where the economy was going and the chances that young people would have, they were also very supportive of letting students graduate sooner and get into the workforce faster. This is probably a lot of what the government was seeing when it started to really think seriously about micro-credentials. Certainly they were hearing it from business, but they were also hearing it from the general public. And you can see again, it crosses all lines, party ID, whether they have a college connection, whether they have children or not. Everybody felt that we should be getting our young people through school faster and hopefully getting them jobs more quickly. So before the pandemic, faced with these realities, people's uncertainty about the economy, worry about young people, belief that folks should get in and out of education faster and into the job market, governments had some tools at their disposal. They had resources to invest, and our expectation was that the next budget would probably be a fairly aggressive investment budget, looking at ways to help businesses thrive, looking at more infrastructure work, investing in the economy. Even so, people were still nervous about where we were going. And now, as you can only imagine, that concern is dramatically magnified. People are far more concerned now. And of course, with 45% of the workforce getting some kind of government support, it's not too hard to imagine why. And when we come out of this, the government will not have the tools that they thought they were going to have at their disposal to boost the economy and help people feel good about their opportunities. And, in the past, without question, these sorts of factors have driven people to college. So if you remember 2007 to 2009, you could see then that there were a lot of folks that went back into college because at that moment their job opportunities weren't great, but they had faith that further education, particularly through college, could get them to the finish line better equipped for the economy. What's going to be the case today, though? Do we still have the same sense that people will flood to colleges? Well, it's a more complicated question, I think, and Ken Steele, who many of you probably follow, just this week published a roll-up of 18 different surveys, all taken after the pandemic started, and looking at, in total, almost 54,000 students. So here's what he found in that roll-up. Students generally are a little disappointed by online delivery as they've experienced it so far. They're very worried about their own health and health risks generally, and indeed with good reason, although many of them also want to get back to campus. They're very concerned about finances and very hesitant to commit to an uncertain fall semester. So I know the presidents have been talking about this and talking about the fact that we have a looming deadline for students to provide their deposits for school. And yet we are not at the place yet where we can tell them definitively what the fall semester will look like. That is a challenge, obviously. And those fears and concerns through these 18 surveys have led to these sorts of results. So when you look at it, a large number of our prospective students, both international and domestic, are thinking about whether they're going to come back to class in the fall. I don't think we know yet where those thoughts will take them, but these are pretty scary numbers for sure. Now, I think there's lots of things that can mitigate this, but these are, figures and concerns that our presidents, our administrations are looking at, and that you'll all have to build into some of your thinking about the budgets for colleges going forward, not really knowing where we will land. Now, interestingly, the CSA, the the College Student Alliance, has also surveyed domestic and international students. Not nearly as big a sample, but students on the ground at 14 colleges that they represent. StatsCan has also done some reporting late this week on how post-secondary students have been affected, and their results align pretty well with the CSA's. Again, probably nothing that would surprise us. Many of the students are really worried about their future job prospects. You can only imagine what it would feel like to graduate into the economy today. Mental health, no surprise, is a growing concern among students and with parents of students. There's lots of reports on canceled work placements, delayed programs and courses, and again, finances topping the list about their concerns. Here's from the CSA survey, a little bit of good news. Even though we're hearing that students are not happy with their online experience, and some university student groups are starting to become vocal in the media about that, the students that CSA surveyed are generally okay. I mean, there's a dissatisfaction rate that's clearly higher than you would like to see it, but generally speaking, given how quickly this has to happen and how little warning we had and how little chance to prepare the very best of what we could probably do online, our students seem to be currently coping with that reality and making it work. Their bigger challenge, of course, is financial. And when you look at these numbers from the CSA, again, you can really see how these government interventions have made a big difference. So when you look at the federal and provincial funding around OSAP and the federal granting program, and then the CERB, the Federal Supplement Program, you can see that these two programs have become the most important sources of financial help to our students, particularly our domestic students. They are not as available to our international students. Same thing right across the board. Family support, not as available to our international students. Scholarships, loans. In fact, the only place in this financial picture where international students are ahead of domestic students is in reporting that they have no financial support for this. And because, other than the financial support that governments are offering right now, job income is the single most important source of financial security, it's also pretty sobering to see that all of the students, with the exception of 19%, so 80% of our students, are struggling in the job market. They've lost jobs, they're working less, they were looking for a job, but there's nothing to be found. So this is a pretty profound challenge for students, particularly as they think about whether they can afford to come to class in the fall. So that was pretty grim, but there are some bright lights, I think, in this that we should be aware of. We do think that just like the recession, Displaced workers are probably going to be looking for further education to find their way back into the workforce, especially if the economy is on the skids for a while and it looks like their chances of finding work shortly are limited. Colleges are usually the biggest beneficiaries of that. People understand that we provide good programs that lead quickly to jobs. We have short-term things like certificates and increasingly micro-credentials, and longer programs that seem very targeted. So we're talking to the government about all of that. Students who have limited finances and yet want to come to post-secondary are far more likely to look closer to home now because they won't be able necessarily to afford travel, residences, those sorts of opportunities. Again, with 200 campuses and satellite campuses across the province, that is usually good news for colleges. And the fact that our educational offerings tend to be really good value for money should help. If you were thinking about coming to college or university right now, then all of the supports from government and the changes to OSAP mean that this is an excellent time to make that choice. And, you know, even though a lot of students are looking at a gap year, I was talking to a colleague of mine who has a grade 12 daughter who's talking about a gap year with her friends. And my colleague, as her parent, said to her, "You have to be kidding me. A gap year is for work and travel, and neither of those things are likely to be available to you, so give your head a shake." So I'm sure there are going to be many of those conversations around dining room tables over the next month or two, so we'll see where that plays out. Do parents really support their young people sitting playing video games in the basement in a gap year because they can't work, there's still some social distancing in place, and travel probably isn't on the table? It might make post-secondary, even if it has to start online initially, more attractive. And many university students are complaining that for them, university and post-secondary requires an on-campus experience, a residence life, orientation, all those sorts of things. And those things are not as critical in a college environment. So that as well may help. And also, you know, some students may well decide, some students may well decide that it's worth taking a run at what they may be able to achieve. I'm moving along here. Okay, let me try to go back. I think I'm just mostly going forward. There we go. Some students may decide that in a lull where many students are choosing to take a gap year, there are opportunities to get into high demand and challenging programs that they might have just missed the cutoff for. This might be a good year to start, and it might be a good year to get started because next year might look a great deal like a double cohort year, and maybe it's not so good to graduate into that. As well, from the international perspective, Canada will still continue to be a destination of choice for international students. And if the governments provincially and federally can find ways to support international students, demonstrate our interest in them, that may bring back international more quickly than we may expect. Apparently, the federal government is already talking about some relaxing of international travel in the mid to late summer. That could help us as well. So while this has all been going on, and in the middle of the pandemic, I thought I'd just step back a little and chat to you about what we've been doing as a system, in many cases with your help, to get through this and help government get through it. You know, I'm always struck, but particularly in challenging times like this, at how well colleges work together. So presidents have been meeting initially 3 times a week, and now once a week. VPs are now meeting once a week, but again started at 3 times, then twice a week, to identify the key challenges for us, figure out which of those could be managed from a system perspective so that nobody gets left behind, no college gets surprised by things other colleges are doing, and then to work through recommendations for government from the system. So immediately we put a short-term ask in front of government very quickly, and that led to $13 million in quick aid to the college system, the only province so far that's offered any kind of aid in that capacity. We now have a longer-term ask in front of government that I'll talk to you about in a moment or two. And then the committees of vice presidents with support from staff at colleges have also worked through a very broad range of issues, from how to get programs online quickly and with best practices to now we've just finished a framework for how to reopen campuses, not when, but at least how in phases this might work, and we've shared it with the government so they can start thinking about reopening our campuses and what that might look like. I was saying to AJ, I just got off a call with the minister where he's starting to talk to us about, are there ways we might pilot programs to get our students who from the fall, or rather from the winter and summer semesters won't be able to complete because of, clinical requirements, lab requirements. What might we do there? And that's all being driven, I think, because of a sense in government that the colleges have their acts together, are working together, and are providing them with good system-wide advice. We're also getting inundated, as some of you may know, with requests for data from government, again, as they try to think about what's coming next, what do we have to do to help. And, I've also been pretty astonished, and shouldn't be, I suppose, with how much colleges are doing in their home communities. We're trying at Colleges Ontario to tweet out a lot of the good work going on at colleges, everything from food bank drives to using residences for emergency housing for first responders, to donating PPE to hospitals and healthcare workers. Just a huge range of things, using applied research to help local businesses and healthcare workers and government figure out the way forward. There's been so much already done, and yet I think there's more that in the next few weeks and months we'll be asked to do. Obviously, we'll have to keep working with government on financial challenges ahead. Again, the Council of Ministers of Education have also expressed a concern to the federal government about the sustainability of the post-secondary system in Canada. I don't believe that's a challenge for us. These will be very challenging financial times, but most of our institutions are in good, healthy financial shape right now. And so that allows the government in Ontario the capacity to help those few colleges who may not be as fiscally, who may be more fiscally challenged. In other parts of Canada, some institutions are in much more difficult financial straits. And so in Canada, this is a live concern for governments. We'll have to do what we can do to support our international students, those who remained in Canada, those who are starting online with us, as well as our domestic students. And we have to, I think, continue to make sure that those students feel that we are there for them and doing what we can. We're going to have to help our students understand what the reality will be in the fall. We're going to have to figure out a good way to communicate with all our stakeholders, our staff, our students, our communities, our businesses, so that we can all work together and try to help get through this, particularly in such an uncertain time. I was thinking about the need to support local businesses and industries, and thinking about the fact that coming out of this pandemic, many of those industries may not themselves fully understand the new realities in the marketplace and what skills they may need from workers and how they might adapt and what innovations they may need to put in place. And I think colleges, because we've been on the front lines of this, may be able to be huge supporters and helpmates to their community in figuring things out. I think we're going to have to use more than ever before the speed and the flexibility of our post-secondary structure to help folks innovate, to figure out new ways of delivering education at a post-secondary level in ways that will help speed the transition for economies and workers. We'll need to be using our applied research capacity more than probably ever before as well. And we're going to need to think about, continuing to collaborate on best practices and using best practices like those in the Center for Innovation and Campus Mental Health to support the whole system going forward. I think if there was ever a time to understand that this is a system and system action helps, this is it. So in this reality, in the moment, what are we talking to the government about? I think we're pretty clear that some of the conversation has to be about funding. There's going to be a lot of folks with their hands out and lots of people, including the business sector, that don't usually have the same asks as the public sector of government, but everybody now is going to be desperately short of cash and needing something from the government. So in that environment, we are certainly talking to the government about stabilizing our funding. They've spent, as many of you have seen, an awful lot of time pulling back funding from post-secondary as the needs of places like healthcare have accelerated. But I think this crisis has been a wake-up call about how dependent post-secondary has had to become as a result on outside sources of income that may not always be there. So we're having a conversation about that. But we're also looking at policy tools that, if the government doesn't have much money, could help colleges get back on their feet faster and own their own destiny a little better. So things like helping us to become leaders in technology-enabled learning. If we want to do more augmented reality, virtual reality embedded in online programming, how can we work with the government to help make that financially possible? Because these things can be expensive. Can we create a library, if you will, a digital library of resources that all institutions could draw from so that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel when we develop augmented and virtual reality tools? Can we see government investment in trying to make Ontario a leader in this area? Because I think one thing that is certainly clear out of the pandemic is this kind of approach, I hope, will not take over post-secondary education, but will be more important as time goes on, at least certainly from the perspective of government. So how can they work with us? Can we get more autonomy, control over credentials? So if we believe a 3-year degree is important for our communities, if we think a master's in an applied area is vital, can we get the autonomy to make those decisions ourselves? Can we look at apprenticeship reform and allow colleges more control over how we get more apprentices into the system, how we graduate the right apprentices in the right trades for our community? And how do we work with the government to make sure that in the last recession, of course, there was second career? How do we figure out the changes that second career will need to meet this crisis, or a new program that might be better suited to what happens after this crisis is over? So we will be looking at all those things with the government, and are now. What else should we be thinking about in the midst of this crisis? Well, I think as system leaders, we're going to have to understand that everybody coming out of this will be facing really significant fiscal challenges and pressures. And so getting a lot of additional money into the public sector, aside perhaps from hospitals, will be a very challenging thing. So we really do need to think about policy levers instead of financial ones going forward. There will be lots of people in society that will have to really rethink their careers or their career paths. Some businesses are going to have to reconsider their models of operating in the economy. We'll have current students who will graduate into a very uncertain time, and maybe into a time when the credential that they thought would clearly get them a good job may not be as relevant as they thought anymore. How do we help turn those things around? How do we help those graduates? You know, just before, as I mentioned, this started, we seem to have an all-consuming focus on AI and the changing economy. And in fact, I think these challenges will be accelerated by the pandemic, especially as people look to new models of operating and experiment with AI more during the pandemic to become more productive. And we'll have to be thinking about that. So, and the last thing I'd say, and I'm going to offer a few slides before to back this up, the OECD has put out recent information just a few months ago that suggests that our students were not very well prepared for career success right across the world, even before the pandemic. And now the path will be even less clear to them. All of these considerations, to me, suggest that this is a leadership moment for colleges, and that many of the challenges we're facing, just like the recession in 2007-9, really speak to what colleges are best at. So what are the opportunities? Well, first, let's take a quick look at what folks thought about post-secondary education, again, late fall of this year. Interestingly, about 38% of the public thought we were going in the wrong direction as an entire post-secondary sector. Although again, when you look at those with a college connection, they had the most favorable view about how post-secondary was doing. And again, my expectation is universities take more of the brunt of this suggestion, because at the time, of course, people were very uncertain about the value proposition of liberal arts education and trending much more to good education that leads to good jobs. And you can see that in this slide. And a number of you will have seen this discussion in my presentations in the past, but this is a new slide that just again demonstrates that that view is accelerating in the public domain, that the main purpose of education is skills and knowledge over personal and intellectual growth, mostly driven by this concern about getting a good job. So before the pandemic, some of what the OECD and the PISA data was showing us is that young people were already struggling to find their way. The economy is complex, and they don't have as clear a view as they should have on the best career options. So there's a couple of slides here that show this. This is from the occupational data from the OECD. And I'll just draw your attention to two particular parts of this slide. In the United States, this one that's in color, computer users. So basically what this is doing is showing you what's the projected growth in these fields and how do students rank these occupations as what they would be interested in pursuing. And you can see just in this one slide, this huge disconnect. Basically, work as a computer expert or IT person in the United States, and then the last line in Canada, there is no connection at all between the growth in these areas, the potential starting income, and where students rank them in terms of their preference for starting a job. So that shows you a small disconnect in this area. But here's a larger one. I don't know if you folks can actually see this slide very well, so I will take you through quickly. What it's basically telling you is whether you were a female or a male, students in high school across 79 participating countries all have virtually the same ideas in their head in 2018 as they had 18 years prior in 2000 for what jobs they should be pursuing. And as you might expect, although it's a little shocking, I think, those jobs tend to be very traditional. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, business managers, architects, all through both male and female. In the boys category, you have to get down to number 8 before somebody even mentions something that looks like it's related to a skilled trade. So this, I think, is telling you that we do have a pretty serious disconnect right across the world between good emerging careers that start you well and give you a connection lifelong to the marketplace of jobs and what our young people think their best occupational options are. And clearly that needs to change. Especially because as we look at what the workplace might look like, I mean, we have been having these discussions, as you know, for several years now, again, looking at AI and the fourth industrial revolution. But technology and our post-pandemic realities are really going to come together much faster, bringing AI and technology much more into play, much more quickly, I think, than we would have imagined. So certainly some industries won't exist as they did. Some of you may have seen the item that was talking about how the Canada Pension Plan is invested fairly heavily in Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines and is about to take $1 billion hit because of that. Some of our companies and our industries, like the travel industry, will be very challenged for a long time to come. And so there will be a lot of transformation in the economy. Tech skills will continue to accelerate as important, but if we are looking at a hybrid economy where people are working remotely more than they used to and from home perhaps more than they used to, the importance of soft skills and bringing people together in new and different ways, finding ways to help people connect and work in teams will be even more important than I think we realized it was. The pace of change will probably accelerate, which again, accelerates the number of times that people will need to reskill, upskill, change their capacity to look at technology in a new and different way. And probably the growth of open workspaces will be reversed. That probably means more remote work, I think, probably also means there'll be new opportunities for regions of our province or in our country that have been geographically challenged over time. You know, I think we were seeing a small movement in this way, but we still found an awful lot of jobs congregating in urban centers in Canada and a lot of the world, and a slow depopulation, in some cases a quicker depopulation of more rural areas, there may be an opportunity to, at least to some extent, reverse a little of that as this plays out. And obviously traditional jobs that all of our students understand and our parents of those students understand will not be as prevalent as careers that are newer and less well understood by people trying to make these decisions. So what do we do to respond to all of this? Well, interestingly, the World Economic Forum had something to say about that in January, before the pandemic really hit us hard. And it's been interesting to me to see that really their thinking, even back then, aligns quite nicely with some of the things that will need to be done in post-secondary. Rethinking the traditional post-secondary model, maybe disconnecting the time from learning. Do we really need to have students in school for 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years if they can move through learning outcomes more quickly? The need to engage with business a little more in a more embedded way, figure out how to apply industry credentials more robustly than we're doing now, figure out how to upskill workers in concert with the industry, moving in lockstep with their needs. Certainly, I think we've done an awful lot of outreach, but probably as a post-secondary system need to do more with K-12 to make sure that teachers, guidance counselors, parents, and students understand our less visible career options and the ones that are newly emerging and maybe not well understood, and also help our upcoming graduates to think about their best options. There'll probably be more private-public partnerships focused on higher education, entertainment, and workforce development, and probably many of those with tech companies that are now stepping in, certainly into K-12, to try to offer teachers the opportunity for training in areas like coding that teachers in K-12 may not have capacity to train their students in, may not need to have that capacity, may never be able to keep up with the speed at which technology is moving, but may be able to rely on technology companies to help work with them to fill some of those gaps. And obviously, we're going to be using more AI-based learning tools that can, as we've talked about for a long time, personalize education and maybe improve educational outcomes. So even though the World Economic Forum talked about that in January, I think it's even more profoundly relevant today. And of course, micro-credentials. We had talked about this earlier, about the government's interest in them early on, but particularly now, as some of our students will be graduating with skills that may be out of date, may no longer be as current as they should be, or within 2 years may not be relevant or as relevant. So some of you have seen some of this I've presented over the past few months. Burning Glass, a company that does, among other things, a lot of research in this area, looked at what would happen if graduates from non-technical university programs who had job prospects that may not be brilliant, did things like took a minor in some other field that was really relevant to the job market, even 1-year certificate or a couple of micro-credentials, and look at these findings. So if they looked at jobs being offered in places like Indeed, Glassdoor, other internet-based job opportunity sites, they found that if you took even a short course in IT, in sales, in social media, in data analytics, in marketing, all these things, you could vastly increase the number of job postings for which you were qualified to apply. And if you got one of those jobs, you could see a real premium on your starting salary. So clearly, as we go forward, how we develop and position and execute micro-credentials will be important. Equally important, I think, will be how do we ladder those credentials into actual full credentials that have relevance long-term, because I can't imagine anything more concerning than having a student come to us, take 2 or 3 micro-credentials and get a good job in a company that only needed a very specific set of skills, only to find that 10 years later the company goes under and they no longer have a credential that stands them in good stead to go on to their next job. So how we move our workforce from micro-credentials to get a good job with specific skills to laddering into full credentials while they may be working at full-time jobs to make sure that they are well connected to the workforce through their whole career, I think is a huge challenge for post-secondary in the coming years. And what about the trades? Everybody has a focus on this and has for a long time because it's an opportunity for people to get good jobs in areas that parents and students don't always think about. And now, of course, the expectation is that there will be more retirements more quickly coming out of COVID-19, which will exacerbate this problem. So many of you have seen some of this from me before. We are continuing and now accelerating our conversations with government about the fact that the apprenticeship system is in huge need of modernization. There are lots of challenges. Students don't know how to get into it. They don't know how to proceed once they're in it. Our apprentices are not actually students of colleges, they're students of the ministry. And so colleges don't have the capacity to have the same eyes on those students, remind them of when they should be back in class, produce some certainty for them. And we think all of that needs to be changed. And we think that if we could look at apprenticeship the way we look at every other college program and made sure that our apprentices had the same capacity and support as the rest of the college students we work with, things would be very different for this area. And frankly, we would probably help to get rid of the stigma that still seems to attach itself to some of the apprentice trades. The public knows this. We poll every year around this, and people's understanding and support for change in apprenticeship hasn't wavered. 77% of people clearly agree that apprenticeship needs to change. And if you add the 15% that are on the fence, virtually the whole of society realizes these are huge challenges that we have to take on for our apprentices and tradespeople. Recently, people have also started telling us that they just don't think we are elevating the skilled trades enough in terms of acceptance and understanding and respect. And so that's led to a conversation, and you can see again, people with a college connection are particularly keen on this. But there is a huge group of the public that believes we should be thinking about master's degrees in apprenticeship and other forms of helping make sure we give apprenticeship the respect it deserves and make it a more interesting opportunity for students. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide because many of you have seen it, only to say that the proposal we have in front of the government would see using OCAS as a one-window portal for anybody that's interested in becoming an apprentice. They could come to OCAS, we could introduce them to the college system, give them a range of options, produce an electronic logbook for them and their employers, collect better data, give them more support, just like any other college student. And we think that this plan and program would help make sure that apprenticeship becomes just as interesting and sought after a professional opportunity as any other program we run. So in conclusion, and leaving a few minutes for questions, I don't think any of us would dispute that we are in a very challenging time, and probably we don't know how far into that challenging time we are. But even though the government's work early on in Canada to support people's incomes, to help businesses, helped reduce anxiety, and you saw that in some of the research on students, their anxiety around financial issues has abated somewhat because of these government programs. People are still a little bit scared, nervous about the economy and the future. And as this continues, more so, you're seeing far more pushback with governments now about the timing to get the economy back and running. Again, I was watching the Premier's press conference yesterday, and for the first time, he was getting relatively aggressive questioning from reporters about the timelines for reopening the economy. That's going to accelerate, I think, as people become more nervous about the future. Even before the pandemic, people were concerned that post-secondary wasn't doing enough to help address their concerns about the economy, their sons and daughters' place in it, my place in it as a mid-career worker that may need help over time. And the government hearing that and now confronted with the realities of the pandemic, there's no question they're starting to look at pretty significant reforms in post-secondary. All they talk about with us these days is online, but it's clearly not the only thing that they're thinking about. Micro-credentials is another, absolutely. I think there's a range of things that they're thinking about, but there may be much more as we come out of this and see what post-secondary is going to need to do to help support the economy re-emerging strongly. And as we talked about, I think this creates challenges and opportunities for us. Clearly, we're going to have to bring the future to our classrooms faster than we expected, but I think we've all been amazed at how quickly we've turned on a dime so far. I don't think that pace of change is going to stop anytime soon. This trend is going to continue. And colleges and universities, I think, alongside government, will have a real leadership role to play in this new reality. We'll need to help our businesses get the workers they need. We'll need to help workers get retrained into what's going to be our emerging economy. We'll need to help our businesses innovate through applied research. We'll need to support our communities through all of this, with all the economic development heft that colleges bring to the table locally. So an awful lot of work to be done, a lot of challenges, but again, in times of crisis, I think this is exactly what the college system was designed for, and I think we will have a really important role to play in the coming months and years in making sure that we emerge successful and strong again as a province. So thank you very much. I will just leave you with a slide of what the new workplace of cubicles might look like in a physical and social distancing world. And AJ, I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Thanks so much, Linda. I'd like to open the floor now to anyone that has any questions. I will leave the floor open for the next little while in case anyone is madly typing away. Just a reminder to everyone, while I wait for any questions that may come in, a recording of this webinar will be available to all attendees and registrants shortly. I will be sending out an email with a link to the webinar as soon as it is over and processed. Linda, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming in. You must have done a fantastic job covering all the bases today. We had a fantastic turnout of attendees.
So clearly I've either done that, AJ, or I've just overwhelmed everybody.
I'm sure it's the first one. Linda, on behalf of OCASA and the OCASA board, I would like to thank you for your time and your presentation today. I'm sure a lot of our members got a lot of important information from the webinar today. And I would just like to remind anyone, if they have any questions about today's webinar, about membership, or any questions on the college sector at all, please feel free to email me, info@ocasa.on.ca, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Linda, thank you. And to everyone, have a pleasant and wonderful long weekend.
You're entirely welcome, AJ. Always a pleasure. Bye, everyone.